I'm Will, I'm the baldbookgeek, and I wanted to talk about fantasy. So, first things first, fantasy is always a very hit and miss genre for me. I love fantasy, but it has to be done right. And I'm just going to talk about 5 fantasy novels I've read recently, or just really think you guys should read. I always say this with like top 5s, that my opinion will change. Like, I could do a top 5 a year from now and it will be completely different. And I've tried to stay in the realms of very modern fantasy. Although I'm going to give a massive mention to The Lord of the Rings before we get going, in my very old beaten up copy of Lord of the Rings. And it's the book that probably started my love, and it's also the book that set the benchmark for fantasy. And I don't think anything's come close to Lord of the Rings in terms of just big epic fantasy. But I'm going to just talk about 5 fantasy novels that are a little bit different, that are, here they are. 5 fantasy books that I think you guys should at least try. So let's start. I'm going to put these here because they're heavy. So first one I picked was The Oyster Thief. 2 parallel stories, one about a mermaid, one about a human. This is a gorgeous fantasy novel. It's beautifully written. It pulls you in, and it just brings you into this world that just you don't tend to see. I've never quite read a fantasy novel like this because it blurs the line. The writing style is literary fiction in the classical sense, but the actual storytelling is fantasy. And it's a fantastic novel, and one I would highly recommend, one that I give and gave very high reviews to just because of its writing and its story and its setting. And I think one that you need to sit down and at least try. She's a very different voice in terms of fantasy, and I'm going to put this on there, so if you guys want to pause and watch the video and see the story, you can. But this book will pull you in and you won't be able to put it down. It's quite a brutal book. It's quite a dark book in places, and that's really what really gets you in. So yeah. So this is an ARC that I got a long time ago. Pretty, isn't it? The Queens Lair. It's a retelling of King Lear. It's a high fantasy retelling of William Shakespeare's King Lear, and it's gorgeous. This book is fantastic, and one that I rated rather highly. I kind of regret never getting the hardback of this, but if I've got the ARC, why do I need the hardback? Kudos to Vaggie, they put it in. You know, 3 sisters, 1 kingdom, a house divided. This is into what I like to refer to as more interpersonal fantasy. Like, the fantasy of this novel is far more structured. It's far more focused on the characters. It's got a little bit in common with Game of Thrones in the terms of just structure, the fact that it is extremely character focused, and the world building is put to the side, although it is there. This Queens of Lair is definitely a unique take on the whole fantasy genre, and just actually a really good book with great storytelling and great characters, and rather pretty, I will say. Nevernight by J. Kristoff. My rule with lists is I will only include the first book in a series, and Nevernight is fantastic. God's Grave is equally as stunning, and Dark Dawn is coming out. I've talked about these books in a video I did a little while ago, so if you want to see that full review. But this is a very different take on fantasy. This is dark, this is violent, this is modern fantasy. And you kind of get pulled in. This gets mislabeled as YA a lot, this book. Partly because J. Kristoff is more known for YA. This book is definitely not YA, and I think it gets mislabeled because the character is a teenager. She's 16 in this book. The subject matter, the tone, and the writing are definitely not YA. And anyone who says new adult exists, nah, that's a marketing ploy. This is adult fantasy, and it's really well done. And I cannot say too much about the story in this one, because if I give too much away, it kind of ruins it. But think rebellion, suns that never set. I mean, the world building in this is spectacular. Now we're going for a more indie book. This is The Kishi. I've talked about this before on my channel. based on African myth, and a lot of people hold up a certain book by a certain black female writer about being the only black fantasy novel, and that's nonsense. This is spectacular. This is a beautiful book. One of 3 that are set within, the writer is planning to do 3 books set within the same world, but each book is a self-contained story. Yeah, I literally inhaled this book in a weekend, and I was sent this by the writer. It's gorgeous. Just the setting, the world building. This is high fantasy, but in a very different way. I think if you want that kind of strong, dark, heavy, intense fantasy that just pulls you in and sets up so much, and it's based on something I'd never really researched. I never knew much about African culture and African myths till I read this book, and then I decided to research. And actually there's such a rich history behind the research of this book that is spectacular. The history and the mythology is just as fascinating as the book written. I'm kind of breaking a rule here, but it's the only way I can show it to you. The Nightblade Epic, Volume 1 by Jarrett Robinson. Not Jarrett. So this is 3 books in one, and probably this is the closest to The Lord of the Rings in terms of tone. But the writing is beautiful in Jarrett's work. Jarrett has a voice that I've never quite heard from a fantasy writer, because he takes what could be quite tropey and flips it on its head, or he uses the trope in such a unique way. You think, why has no one thought of this before? It's simple but brilliant. He's fantastic at building characters and making these characters believable and strong and interesting. He's also very diverse. If you want a very diverse fantasy that's got powerful, strong women, LGBT topics, and countless other things, you really do need to check out Jarrett Robinson. He is a phenomenal writer, and you know what? I've inhaled the entirety of these at this point, I think. No, there's one I haven't read yet, but yeah, he is a phenomenal writer and someone that is definitely worth checking out. I was going to include more modern fantasy in this list. I was going to include his Dark Materials and Harry Potter and stuff like that, but I decided to just go down the very root core of fantasy and stick within a fantasy world with fantasy settings and just do it that way, rather than go crazy and say, well, this is fantasy but it's urban fantasy. I didn't want to do that whole list, so I just stuck to my guns and picked things that were set in different worlds. I mean, tell me what you guys think, because I'm always fascinated to know. But these are fantastic books, and do read them. And you know what? All of my links are down below in the doobly-doo. Please like and subscribe, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye.